said, my name's Bill Hubbard, Director of the Centre for Research Communication at the University of Nottingham, and what I'm talking about this afternoon is about how to encourage open access and the need for policies to support that, and for those policies from different stakeholders to actually work together, because when they don't work together, things get clogged up and nothing much moves. So the structure of my presentation this afternoon, I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, which should give us an equal amount of time at the end for discussion and questions. And in outline, I'm going to be looking at what open access is and how to achieve it. I think that this is going to be fairly well known territory for folks that are joining us today, but I just wanted to very quickly go through it just to make sure we've got a common understanding. I'm going to look at incentives for open access and maybe what blocks it, looking at this from the point of view of incentives, stakeholder interests, and how these might sometimes combine and sometimes clash. I'm going to be looking at how to get movement in policy development, how to actually get change underway, and then just looking at sort of when policies clash, expectations clash, how do we resolve that before ending up with the idea of supporting, because the situation that we have now is that many researchers are being encouraged to make their work openly accessible, or would like to make their work openly accessible, but they're faced with a bewildering array of policies from their institution, maybe, funders, publishers, sometimes from their national government, sometimes from their own learned discipline, which may have informal but nonetheless quite stringent policies about where you publish or how you publish. And so sorting all these things out can be a very complex task for a researcher. So my point with the whole presentation really is that you need a supportive policy environment to make things as easy as possible for researchers. Okay, let's kick off. Now, open access, as I'm sure you're aware, is access to research articles and any other outputs that's free at the point of use. Now, over the last 10 years that open access has really been growing, there's been an unfortunate misuse. There's been an unfortunate development, really, that very often open access is referred to just as that, just as material that's available to read, free at the point of use. And very often it's missed that really open access was always intended to be free of most licensing restrictions, so that not only is material free to read, but it's also free to use. In other words, you can download it, you can reuse it, you can print it off, you can use it with your students, you can include chunks of it in other works, you can data mine it, you can process it, you can do what you want with it. That's truly open access. And of course, increasingly now we're seeing open access being asked for the underlying research as well. That's actually quite exciting. So with all of this, when I'm saying free, I'm using this in a conversational sense as opposed to a strict sense, because obviously nothing is truly free. Open access, even if material is available on the web, it's not absolutely free. You still need to be able to afford a computer, you still need to be able to afford an internet connection. But since those costs are relatively dispersed and are included within sort of general infrastructure now, just talk about that as essentially free. Certainly free at point of use, nobody has to pay to actually get the material with open access. Okay, now there are two routes to this. There's the route where material is made available by putting it into a repository, a digital duplicate of an already published article, or an article which is going to be published in a traditional subscription journal is put into a repository and then made openly accessible. Sometimes it has to be said openly accessible as in free to read, but not openly accessible as in free to data mine. As part of this conversation is slight confusion over the terms of open access. The open access repositories that are around at the moment, open access to read, open access to reuse, and actually what's available to reuse and what's just to is actually sometimes quite complex, because to describe which is which very often isn't there. But anyway, the green route, so-called, is about putting material into a repository, and this can be contrasted with publishing in a journal that makes the article open access from the get-go, and that's called the gold route. Now, to publish in a journal that makes the article open access, obviously somebody is being asked to pay the publisher for the work that they do in formatting the material and actually into a journal, and so for the gold route it's typical that you make a payment to actually publish the material. The author makes the payment as opposed to the reader making the payment via a subscription. So those two routes to open access, the so-called green and gold, are complementary. They're not in competition with each other, and some of the open access advocates seem to more concerned about the route by which these things happen, rather than actually just opening access to research itself. So those two are complementary routes. Some people favour one, some people favour another. Now for repositories, just looking at the repositories that there are in the world, these are listed in a service we run called OpenDOR, DOAR standing for Directory of Open Access Repositories. The URL for this is on a slide at the right at the end, as are URLs for other materials I'll reference during my presentation. So within OpenDOR, we list the world's open access repositories that contain material of academic use, and that are also full text. We don't list things which just list metadata, just list publication records, for example. Now at the moment we've got about 2,600, I think, repositories around the world, and these are split between institutional repositories based in research institutions, typically universities or higher education centres, but also subject-based repositories, where just these are collections of particular disciplinary papers, or they're governmental. The government has actually sponsored the repository. And typically these are free for the user to deposit, so they're free for the user to deposit their material and free for the reader to actually access the material. And typically as well with repositories, these accompany publication in a traditional journal, so they are an adjunct as opposed to a replacement for publication. For open access journals, the fully open access journals are listed in the DOAJ, Directory of Open Access Journals. But in addition to these fully open access journals, there are hybrid open access journals. These are typical subscription journals that make their money from subscription, but who will also, for a fee, make a particular article accessible. So that fee, but it's hovering around £1,500, couple of $1,000, couple of €1,000, something like that. Now, of course, if you publish in an open access journal, there's nothing to say that you shouldn't deposit as well. Okay. That's the sort of what open access is. The routes to get it. For incentives, now this is where we start running into the territory of policies, because different stakeholders in the process have different incentives and different drivers. So some of the incentives that are typically associated with open access are first and foremost wider readership. Of course, there have been a number of studies shown that the material that's made openly accessible attracts greater citations, dramatically so. I mean, in the multiples of 100% greater citations. Actually shows that there is an untapped ship out there, that the current system subscription journals is not reaching all of the people that actually want to both read it and use it and who will cite it. So open access is generally taken to mean that greater use is made of research. Now, all of those things are very attractive for an individual academic that's working on a paper. They would like, I think, to get wider readership, more citations, and more use of their research. It's more value to them. But it's also a far better return on investment for funders. So for funders as a stakeholder, some of these incentives are very attractive as well. You get a perpetual record of work, which is always accessible, so that if a funder or an institution wishes to do some sort of assessment of research to look at how the research that they have funded or that they've sponsored or they have supported in some way, how that's developed over time, they've got this permanently accessible record, which is good. That's also good for an academic as you move from institution to institution. If your material is open access, you've always got this catalogue of material that can always be accessed. It's not hidden behind some subscription wall on a publisher's site. It's always openly accessible. You can always refer to it. So as I say here, we've got easier assessment of research. So that's kind of attractive to governments that are trying to assess the value of the investment that they put into research. And if they want to look at what's come out of it, they can easily do that if the material is openly accessible. And then also there are these final 2 points on meta-studies and data mining, that sort of thing, which become far easier if the material is openly accessible, if it can be processed and automatically analysed, and brings into play some of the more exciting aspects of sort of automated research, of meta-research. So there are a number of incentives to make material openly accessible. But in addition to this, there is the very strong moral case that if publicly funded research can be made freely available, then it should be made freely available. And as a kind of a proof of that, I'd ask you to consider the other case. If we lived in an open access world, if all research material was available to anybody on demand whenever they wanted it, for free, downloadable, data mineable, machine processable, would we actually choose to change to a system where the majority of that material is actually locked up and to select a few people who could afford to pay for it? And light, it shows that open access is an inevitable system. I hope it's an inevitable system, but it's certainly a better way of working, because we would choose to have the system we have now if the alternative was an open world. So really, there's a very strong case there, and what we've got to do is to see how we can move from the situation we have now to the situation that we want where material is openly accessible. That a series of integrated and supportive policies from all of the different stakeholders is required. Whoops, did I flick over 2 there? Yeah, okay. We've got stakeholders. So these are the stakeholders. I mean, I'm sure that we could come up with more if we scratch their heads a bit, but these are the stakeholders that I would see in the research process. Each of them have a different interest, and each of them will have different policies or habits of behaviour, in the case of some of the more informed, which are going to their attitude to open access. For example, I've got authors and researchers, and while I'm aware that an individual author might not sit down one day and be able to say, okay, well, I have a policy on the way that I teach, nevertheless, there could be many informal or even formal policies that affect the way that they directly work. For example, within a research group, there might be a policy that you only publish in a high-impact journal, for example. Now, that might or might not be written down on paper. It might be a kind of a cultural policy, but there might be a policy which where a researcher is only promoted if they have a particular publication record in particular journals. Now, if there are those behavioural policies in place, it's actually going to be very difficult to change those to for a new publication environment unless it's realised that those policies are in place and might need to change. In other words, we're talking about almost cultural change there. Publishers have got a very clear interest in this. Their business case is really based on limiting the access to research. That's part of the deal that they have. In return for publishing this material, they'll take certain rights, which means they get access, so that they can charge for that. Funders want to see a good return on their investment, as does the government, as eventually does the public in this. The public, what are we doing research for? In the end, we're doing research to make life better for people. So at a very kind of high level, the government and the public want to see research being used to make life better, not just locked away in some subscription journal where very few people can read it. If it's effectively, if it's not going to improve the quality of life, if it's not going to improve culture, if it's not going to improve the lot of people, then why are we doing it? So those stakeholders all have particular interests, and that all of their interests are going to have particular effects with their policies. Now, in terms of blocks to open access policies, typically we've always seen publishers as being a particular block because they have this business interest in restricting access to research, whereas we're wanting to open access to research. So how can we persuade publishers to adapt their business models, or should we be persuading them to adapt their business models? As a service industry, shouldn't they be adapting to what researchers and academics actually want? But in addition to publishers, as I said, there are other policies, formal and informal, from other stakeholders which might block progress towards open access. For example, I mentioned the idea of only publishing in a high-impact journal as being a desirable thing for some research groups. Now, if you take a journal brand as a measure of quality, as opposed to the article itself having a measure of quality, maybe from the citations that it receives, then that sort of locks us into using that journal. So if everybody in a biochemical research group has to publish in the Journal of Very Learned Biochemistry or something, if they have to publish in that particular journal, it will be very difficult to move to open access unless that particular journal makes open access possible. So these sort of administrative policies about where to publish can block progress towards open access. Funders are very often reluctant to upset researchers by putting in place policies which seem too stringent, because I think a lot of funders, somewhat to my surprise, I found that a lot of funders respond are very reluctant to force things or to ask academics to work in a way that where there might be a low level of compliance. I think funders are very often reluctant to appear out of touch. So if they put in place a policy that only gets very low levels of compliance, it's kind of a bit embarrassing for them. And although that seems a sort of slightly odd reason to block open access, just something like that can block progress towards open access, because effective policies have to address each of these issues. And if any one of these sort of things is in place, it can block the whole progress towards open access. So all of these policies really have to mesh together. Simple policies to encourage open access, unfortunately, I have to say they don't seem to work. The RCUK, the research councils in the UK, which is the main route by which government funding is dispersed to universities and to researchers, 7 different councils, one dealing with physics, one dealing with the natural environment, one dealing with biology, etc., etc. Jointly, they came together in 2006 and came up with a policy to encourage open access, which was largely ignored, unfortunately. A few academics that were already keen on open access adopted it and made their material open access, but they had very, very low levels of compliance, I think under 10%. Similarly, with institutions where they have policies encouraging open access, there's not really been that much of a response. Where it's mandated with a sanction, then there might be more of a response. There's one university in the UK, Salford, whose vice-chancellor is very keen on open access, and he's made it a requirement that only those materials which are actually made open access will be considered when an academic applies for promotion, for example. So with a sanction like that, then yes, you get some sort of reaction. But otherwise, if it's just encouraging open access, then academics can simply ignore it, because what's the incentive to change? If the incentive to change is just that you're being told we'd like to encourage open access, but there is inertia of embedded publication habits, of value judgments of where you should publish, the professional esteem indicators, that financial arrangements are already in place. Some learned societies have made it so that their financial stability is dependent on generating income from their journals, etc. When there is no incentive or little incentive to change, and there is that inertia in place, you just don't get effective change. So, what about the place of funders in all this? And for me, the place of funders is right at the head of the research process. Now, obviously, research is a cycle. You have researchers obtaining money from funders, going off doing research, writing it up, becoming authors, publishing it, other people reading it, sparking off new ideas for research. Funders hear about these new ideas for research and maybe put a program in place to address these this new area for research, or researchers themselves might suggest to funders that they fund work in a particular area, and the whole thing is a cycle, obviously. However, if there is one point where the cycle is naturally broken, it is at the funder level. Funders are upstream of research activity. There's the saying, he who pays the piper calls the tune. If the funder is actually funding research, they can associate conditions with their grants to insist upon open access to the research findings. And therefore, any work that comes out of that funded research can come down to the researcher, to the publisher, with those conditions intact. So other policies that are downstream of that funder decision, other policies, whether they're informal, as in a research group saying you have to publish in a high impact journal, or whether they're formal, where a publisher is asking for complete copyright transfer and you can't make it openly accessible. Really, they have to deal with the fact that the material from this particular research project, for example, already has a policy associated with it that the results must be made openly accessible. So the other policies have to respond to and respect those funder policies. And if they don't, then the political question can be asked, why not? And that's quite a powerful thing to be able to ask a publisher, for example, if they're insisting on closed access publication. Why are you asking that when the publisher wishes it, when the funder wishes it otherwise? And of course, the opposite also applies, that without funder backing, could any sort of policy environment really succeed? So for me, the place of funders are absolutely key in all this. Okay, well, time to get tough. We've just mentioned that from 2006, certainly in the UK, there was encouragement for open access, but it didn't really take off that much. There were experiments elsewhere, obviously, particularly the National Institutes for Health in the States. The European Union, the 7th framework, had open access as a requirement for some projects, but not all of them. But then the financial crisis came along, and certainly in the UK, I think that changed things quite considerably, because people began to look at what they were spending and why they were spending it, and asking what value they got from it at a very high level. And in the UK, the Finch report, the committee called the Finch Committee, looked into the whole issue of open access and made certain recommendations that the government then followed, so that there is now a government policy in place requiring access to funded research. The research councils relaunched their policy to insist on open access to research, and the European Union, my main examples are from the UK, but I'll just mention in passing that after the experiment in the 7th framework, the European Union is now making it a condition of funding in their Horizon 2020 programme that material has to be made open access. And finally, and most significantly for the UK, there's now a policy for our future research assessment exercise, which I'll come on to in a second. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a drink. Hi, I'm back, having cleared my throat. Right, let's carry on. As I said, the UK government has now position that any of the research that it funds in the funds that it gives out to universities, if research is done on the back of this, then it has to be made openly accessible with a maximum of 12-month embargo. That's got an implication for humanities work, which has often been seen as outside these policies because it sometimes doesn't attract additional research funding, project funding. It's just done by the academic as part of their salary. With this government policy, it means that any government funding which is supporting academic salaries it means that any of that government funding that's used for research, that research has to be made openly accessible. So that was a significant step. The research councils, as I said before, they were asking for open access. Now they've made it mandatory, and as you can see here, we've got an initial compliance target of 45%, but that will rise in the future. And lack of compliance will affect future grants. So there's a shadow of a sanction there. And finally, the UK research assessment exercise. I'm not sure that if you'd know about this, there's no particular reason why you should, but certainly in the UK it's a very major exercise where every 6 years or so individual academics, individual departments, individual universities are all assessed on the basis of the research that they've produced during that 6 years, and on the basis of peer review of that research, their funding profile for the following 6 years is then worked out. Are they a 4 department, a 5 department, a 5-star department, or whatever else? So this is a very big deal indeed for universities in the UK, and who will generally tie themselves in knots to make sure that they get a good outcome from the research assessment exercise. And lo and behold, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, HEFCE, has said that to be eligible for assessment, materials have to be made open access from the point of acceptance for publication. And they're promoting green access, not gold open access, green open access, so that asks for all the materials to be made available through the institutional repository. So that's a very particularly strong policy driver. And in general, publishers have responded to this, but maybe in slightly different ways, in that publishers now say that they require copyright transfer and you can material open access unless funded by the UK, funded by the NIH, unless you're funded by particular funders who've got particular requirements. So it's a great pity that those publishers haven't moved just to say, yes, okay, we will allow open access, that they've made it far more difficult and the policy complex by saying, well, we'll let you only if you're funded by these particular people. Now, some publishers, for example, Elsevier, they have even more complexes, where Elsevier has gone so far as to say, yes, you can archive your material and make it freely, unless your fund tells you that you've got to, or unless your institution tells you that you've got to, in which case there has to be a separate agreement. So in other words, what Elsevier is saying, we'll let you archive to, but not if you've been told to. Now, that makes for a very complicated policy for an individual researcher. Now, there's also concern about the option where you pay to make an individual article freely available, because it's been recognized that subscription journal is already having all of its covered and profit made for by the subscription, then an additional, say, $2,000 an article That's just profit. If an additional fee is paid to make the article open access, so it's put on a server, that's just profit. So there are concerns about double dipping on a kind of a national and international scale. There are also speculation on what those fee levels will be like in the future, what's to stop fee level inflation. So there are still some concerns there about the way that some publishers are adapting to the open access environment, maybe by promoting the hybrid option. There are also concerns about moves into rights in data. So very often publishers are now asking for data to accompany the publication of an article, and with concerns that we have to establish that who that data belongs to, so that rights in data aren't assumed in the way that rights in text have been assumed in the past. So overall, the picture is fragmenting and the policy environment is more complex. And I just invite you to pity the researcher. This is a series of slides just to show how things have over the past few years. Here we can see in the past it was relatively straightforward that funding to an institution who gave it to a researcher who gave material to a publisher, the publisher did. That's fairly straightforward. So if you're a researcher, you can see what's going on. But then once institutional repositories came into the picture, the researcher then had an additional thing to consider. Once they gave it to the publisher, should they also put it in the institutional repository? And then if there was a mandate being the researcher had to then read and understand those mandates to see if they were asking them to put it in the institutional repository or give it to a publisher. There might have been a mandate from the institution as well, in which case the researcher had to understand all of those mandates, make sure and that if they're publishing with a particular that the policy will allow them mandates to do, so that they might be asked to publish with an open access publisher or with a hybrid, with an open access option, and have to make a choice. Those publishers might then put the material into a central or a subject repository, which they might be required to do by their funder, or they might actually do that themselves, put it into the institutional repository. That's the institutional policy requirement. They might have to put it into an institutional database as well as put the metadata into a database. They might actually have to pay the publisher with the open access option or pay the publisher. They might have to go back to the funder to get the money, pay the publisher. They might have to go to the institution to get the money to then pay the publisher, etc. So it's getting fairly complicated. When you think about as well, you can see that you get a very, very complex set of activities that occur around publication that very unfavourably with the past. So, the kind of world that we're now in, and I'd suggest that yes, sometimes it is. So we do have to make sure these policies all match, all engage with each other, and that the researcher is well supported with infrastructure services. So the most important authors and researchers have clarity, because none of this should interrupt the way that research is being done. The responsibility for compliance checking, for example, should be defined in policies. It would be useful if funders could adopt common policies. So the European Union wanted the same thing as the Research Councils UK wanted the same thing as NIH. If there was agreement on allowable embargo periods, for example. Institutions should make sure that their own policies harmonise with their funders, so that their funders aren't asking a researcher to do one thing, the institution isn't asking them to do something else. And surely publishers as a service industry should be serving the needs of funders, institutions, authors, and readers, and they should simplify their response as opposed to making it more complex and actually adapt to this changing world. And obviously, as I said, we should have systems, automated systems as far as possible, in place to support the researcher. So coming back to my point that the funder policies I would see as key, and that a funder policy should mandate open access and there should be some sanction for non-compliance. It should have some cognizance of cost, and green is cheaper than gold. I do believe that repositories are a better and cheaper alternative than gold publication right now. If it's archiving, then it has to be defined what is to be archived when and where, which repository. But we have to respect current conditions. We have to reluctantly allow embargoes. But there has to be the aim of eliminating those embargoes in the fullness of time, so that we're not constantly looking at open access material which is 12 or 24 months out of date. We have to allow for disciplinary differences, because some areas like arts and humanities publish their research through books, for which there are separate issues. But we have to have realistic targets. Those funder policies have to have realistic targets. As I pointed out, the RCUK had a target of 45% compliance in their first year, rising to 55% in the second year. There has to be some realistic graded targets. And finally, the funders have to work with other stakeholders and take cognizance of their own incentives, their own needs, their own desires, and their own policies. But for true change to happen, the funders have to insist on change. So just to wrap, my final slide is that there is an inevitable development, that obviously online journals are now the norm, but they will become the primary form, I believe, and the form of the journal will change to accommodate the online potential of incorporating multimedia material, incorporating the original data sets, etc. And in line with this, open access will continue to grow and will become the dominant method of research dissemination. I believe that open access to data will develop and allow new research forms to be built on top of this, so that if we're putting in place policy structures for the future, they have to support this sort of picture. Okay, that's the end of my presentation.